Good morning, everyone, and you are welcome to day 6 of the Lawyers in Energy Network training in partnership with Centurion Law and Brumshi Consultancy. My name is Rakiba Oloko. I'm the Executive Secretary of Lawyers in Energy, and I'm your host for today. Over the past several days, we have had several distinguished energy consultants come to educate us on how to understand transaction management in the African energy practice, looking at it from the negotiation process, understanding the governing laws and regulations, due diligence investigations, and contractual relations in the African energy industry. Today, we will be moving on to practical steps to agreement drafting in the African energy industry, looking at drafting of the gas transportation agreements. To put us through today's topic is an erudite scholar in the energy space in person of Mr. Emeka Osuji. Mr. Emeka Osuji, as is called, is a director in the law firm of Olaniwun Ajayi LP. He was formerly a legal assistant with the Oil and Gas Sector Reforms Implementation Presidential Committee, where he was involved in the drafting of the Petroleum Industry Bill. He has more than a decade experience spanning oil and gas financing, licensing and regulatory compliance, corporate and project financing, dispute resolutions, among others. He has particular expertise in the negotiation and drafting of oil and gas related agreements, such as gas sale and purchase agreements, gas transportation agreements, crude sale and purchase agreements, crude handling agreements, JOAs, CNGs, and LPG sales agreements, etc. He also has significant experience in legislative drafting, some of which includes the review of the framework and guidelines of non-interest finance institutions for the Central Bank of Nigeria, review of guidelines for the Nigerian Content Development Monitoring Board, and as well as the Nigerian Content Development Monitoring Board Joint Qualification System. Mr. Emeka is a member of the Nigerian Gas Association, which is itself a chartered member of the International Gas Union. Welcome, Mr. Emeka. We are honored to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Rakiba. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Just to confirm that you can hear me clearly.
We can hear you very clearly, and good morning to you, sir.
All right, thank you. I think I'll start without any further ado. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay, just a moment. Yeah, just to confirm that you can see the presentation on the screen. Rakiba, can you see it?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, fantastic.
We can see your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So I'll just start as quickly as I can. And what I'll try to do is I'll try to run quickly through these 3 core areas, which is I'll sort of give an overview of gas transportation agreements. And in doing so, of course, I won't certainly not be doing a clause-by-clause review. It will be of limited relevance considering the time and the people within in the room at the moment. But what I'll do is I'll sort of explain some of the key philosophies that underpin some of the things you typically see in the GTA. So typically when I try to do agreement review or sort of to x-ray how agreements are pretty much couched on the key considerations, I tend to focus more on what I call the key principles and philosophies behind setting of the draft. So an understanding of those dynamics enables one, when you're drafting or reviewing, or even trying to get comfortable with the document, to then appreciate what the nuances are. Because more often than not, no two agreements are the same. While we generally have broad philosophies that regulate certain types of agreements, and in certain instances, you might even have what is known as industry templates. But generally, no two agreements are the same. So the position of the parties, as well as their bargaining strengths, and as well as the commercial realities of the deal, more often than not, influences the extent to which certain belts and braces are introduced into an agreement. So that's pretty much what I'll be doing in the first segment. In the second segment, I'll just do a little twist to introduce us and to just talk a little bit about the Gas Transportation Network Code and how it pretty much has changed the landscape in relation to certain GTAs. Just a little bit on that. And then in the last segment, I will then do a more detailed review of what I call few key provisions of a typical GTA, just to sort of give a broad sense of what one would expect to see, why one would expect to see it, and then how those pretty much plays out. So that's it. But in terms of how I will proceed, I know I'm entitled to just carry on for a while. Then we take questions at the end. But what I do is when I have finished what I call a key theme, I might pause and ask if anyone has any question or need for clarification on a key theme. So, but that's solely at my discretion, just to note. So when I'm done with the key theme, I might pause, just so it's a little bit interactive. For some people, it gets a bit boring having to just sit and listen for 1 hour to somebody go on and on. So I will do that from time to time. Then if anyone has any thoughts or perspectives or questions, you can bring it to the house. Then to the extent to which I can respond, I will do so. If I can't, I'll put the question back to the house. And I'm sure we have many experts here who can also help to enrich our knowledge on these points. All right, so I start. So moving quickly, of course, as you know, the Gas Transportation Agreement, as the name says, is pretty much an agreement that regulates the relationship between a transporter, who is the owner or operator of a pipeline, and the shipper, that is the person on whose behalf, not necessarily the owner, but the person on whose behalf molecules of gas is being transported. So that's pretty much what the agreement pretty much does. And I've said here, the GTA sits right within the midstream, which is a critical component because it's an interlinkage between the upstream and the downstream. And also important to note in this regard that as it relates to GTAs, sometimes you then begin to see GTAs that relate to bulk transportation of gas right from the upstream. And of course, you then have an equivalent for crude transport. But for today, we're focusing on GTAs. For bulk transportation of gas, major trunk lines that you see, for example, the Alps is one of those pipelines. And then further downstream, you then begin to have more, slightly more dedicated, smaller network of pipelines that move gas from maybe a certain city gate to the end users and in whatever locations they might be, individuals, companies, or industries. So that's just pretty much the GTA. So, there are two broad philosophies that I've brought out. You then have two types of, in terms of how the GTA is constructed. So you have a single dedicated pipeline, for example. So I might be an asset owner in the upstream, and for the purposes of transporting the gas that I intend to deliver to a customer downstream, I might set up either by myself directly or through an affiliate, gas transportation net, both the pipeline and then set up a structure for that to be done. So, but that is a single user pipeline and one person is using it. I might sort of have a scenario where I set up a pipeline with the intention that that pipeline can be used and accessed by multiple users. And as we go in the course of this discussion, we then begin to see how the law has contemplated and taken into consideration all these scenarios and rules around open access, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of capacity, pretty much what is going on is that a shipper approaches a transporter and says, I would like molecules of gas to be transported for me from point A to point B. But in terms of the philosophy, it could be a quantity-based arrangement, in which case the tariff, which is the payment made to the transporter for the transportation, is focused only on the quantities being transferred. And in that regard, so you just pay a tariff which is multiplied by and then computed on the basis of the volumes of gas that are being transported in the pipeline. When that happens, because the transporter himself, understandably, we know that sometimes you may not be able to transport the full volumes that you want. he wants to have certain minimum revenue guarantees. So he begins to then introduce things like ship or pay obligations. And I'll speak more about the ship or pay obligations but the important thing to note is that this pretty much is based on the quantities being transported. And from a transporter point of view, he wants to ensure that at the minimum, he has certain guaranteed revenues or income under that arrangement. The other flip side of it is what is known as the capacity reservation sort of model. And what that happens is that even though you have molecules to transfer, the transporter will require you to book and to reserve a certain minimum capacity. So that capacity is your reserve capacity, which is reserved for you. You can then have additional molecules on top of it and pay tariffs for all that. But irrespective of what you transport or not, you will still pay that capacity reservation charge. And that, again, the philosophy behind that, again, as I explained at the beginning, is pretty much to guarantee sort of revenues for the transporter. So he's sure. And in the next slides, I'll also speak to some of the other considerations that influence some of these models that come to be in the market. So more often than not, what you begin to see, and it's important to say this at the beginning, while various models of contracting have developed, both for GSAs or GTAs or GPOs or etc., you will see that what you more often than not see in the market are sort of like hybrid structures. So you see structures that adapt a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That's not a problem. Typically, like I said again, it's a function of where the parties sit, how they see their bargaining strengths, and as well as the other commercial and operational realities. Those are the things that will influence which patterns to adopt and which not to adopt. So in this slide, what I've tried to do is to, as it relates to the shipper and the transporter, remember we are talking about a commodity that's, is it tangible or intangible? It cannot be handled physically. It's difficult to put it together except you convert it to maybe CNG or LNG. So the nuances around the dynamics of it changes. And more often than not, as I said, you begin to see that you have multiple shipper pipelines. So what that means is that I own a pipeline as a transporter, but 3 people have their gas molecules injected into my pipeline to be transported. When it gets into that pipeline, unlike maybe transporting boxes of shoes, you can say, this is my box of shoes and this is yours. You can't do that for molecules of gas. Everything gets into the pipeline in the commingled stream, and at the end of the pipeline, it comes out again in that commingled stream. And by commingled stream, what I mean is the molecules of the gas mix together, and a whole lot of rules and principles around how to manage that to make sure there's no contamination, the specs remain within the range, and also that you can maintain the integrity of the pipeline. But the important point we want to discuss here is, as it relates to the shipper and the transporter, what happens? Legally speaking, because of course we're looking at the context of agreement drafting. So as it relates to title, by the time the shipper brings or makes the gas available to the inlet point into the pipeline, title to the gas is with the shipper. Now, in the pipeline, what that means is that having injected the gas into the pipeline, either directly or through some other third party, the transporter then takes physical custody of the gas. But title to the gas does not necessarily pass to the transporter. He only has physical custody of the gas at that point. And at the end, at the delivery point, the transporter will hand over physical custody of the gas to the shipper or to whomever the shipper has requested that it be delivered to. So that's pretty much what you see happens to title. I, as shipper, take title. I give you physical custody, but I do not give you title. At the end, you then hand it over, redeliver it back to me. And of course, title remains with me all through. It's important to note, however, that there are a few models where this is not even the case, which is that title passes to the transporter when the gas is within the pipeline. And then at the redelivery point, the title will again pass. That is not a very common model on the market, but there are few models of GTAs that have that approach. But the more predominant model you would see in this market and in most places is that the shipper retains title to the gas all through. And what the transporter has at the point of transportation is only physical custody to the gas. Now, as it relates to risk, so when the shipper has handed over physical custody of the gas to the transporter, risk in the gas will pass to the transporter. So if there's risk of loss, contamination, it goes off spec, something happens to the gas, the risk passes on to the transporter. So what happens is then you begin to see a balancing act in the GTA. You begin to see provisions where the transporter is basically trying to manage that risk. He will try to exculpate himself from certain liabilities. He will try to reduce thresholds. He will try to introduce certain parameters just to manage and mitigate that risk. But largely, the risk will remain. There are very few constructs where you begin to see that the shipper will retain the risk. The risk will pass to the transporter. And then the documentation would then say what happens if the gas becomes off-spec gas by the time it's delivered. If the volumes that I handed over to a transporter is no longer the volumes I received at the end, or if for some reason something happens and my gas goes poof and I can't get my gas back. So all that is dealt with. Then, of course, I also spoken about custody, how custody is transferred. And by custody, I mean both legal and physical custody. So what you transfer is both legal and physical custody. So at the time the gas, so physically speaking, the transporter has custody of the gas, also has legal custody. So at the time the gas is within this pipeline, he has almost full dominion and can exercise full rights against any third parties. Any third parties, no encumbrances, nobody can come and try to exercise control over the gas within the pipeline at that moment. So when I say custody, I sort of mean both physical and to a large extent, subject of course to the rights of the shipper who retains title to the gas. He has physical and legal custody to the gas. So if you look at the text below on the screen, I've sort of spoken about some of the nuances around some of these things and how it pretty much works. But that's just the important thing to know around the construct. So once you use that as a base, then it's easy to begin to dimension the rights and liabilities of the parties, and I mean the shipper and the transporter, at each point in time, before the gas gets to the inlet point, when it is injected into the inlet point, and then when it is redelivered. This dimensioning along this basis of which I've tried to demarcate here also just helps you to give you a pictorial view of how the liabilities are likely to be apportioned between the parties. Here, I just speak about two, what I call pretty much like two broad concepts in relating to the philosophy of the GTAs pretty much. And one is one where I've said it's seen as a single economic package, where the transporter having economic interest in the performance of the GSA. What do I mean by this? I will use an example again, and examples are actually, I find it very useful to illustrate concepts. I have an upstream asset, right, that produces gas, and then I have to deliver that gas to some customer downstream. So I set up a project via which I as an entity will be the one selling the gas to the customer downstream. And then either I myself or my affiliates, which more often than not will be the case, will be a transporter because I'm going to develop a pipeline for the purposes of transporting the gas. In the end, we will sell the gas to him. So sometimes you then begin to see GTAs where in negotiating the GTA, the parties are taking into keen consideration the nuances of the GSA that has been signed the upstream or the GSA that is signed downstream. Why is that important? So rather than going to negotiate the GTA as a purely independent contract, everybody says, I don't care what happens. For me, for transporter, my job is just to move gas for you. You give me my tariffs. If you don't, then consequences. And I, as a shipper, will say, okay, vice versa. No. They begin to see the GTA as only a midstream activity that is relevant within the context of an upstream activity and another upstream activity. In that event, you then begin to see that in negotiating the gas transportation agreement, you need to be careful to look at what has been negotiated in the upstream. So in terms of the volumes, in terms of the specs, in terms of the liabilities, in terms of the consequences of breach, in terms of what happens when there's undersupply, etc., in terms of force majeure applications and its impact not only on the GSA, but also on the GTA. So you begin to see a gas transportation agreement that reflects to some extent nuances of the operational and commercial realities of the upstream end and the downstream end. And why did I say so? Because the parties are looking at it from that sort of as a single economic package. This is merely a linkage, which is what I said at the very beginning, between the upstream and the downstream. So I have to make sure that in negotiating my GTA, I'm not just negotiating it as if it's an independent relationship. The second point that we made here, and of course, we speak about transporter sharing interruption, stepping right under the GSA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all those are nuances, which of course I'll speak more about later on. Then pipeline system rules, what are we talking about? Two broad rules, and we'll get to that in more detail later on. One is the bilateral arrangement, where the owner of a pipeline enters into GTAs with multiple shippers, as many as possible. He tries to keep them as consistent as possible, but they are bilateral, so the terms are not necessarily the same. Then you then have a different framework which talks about common rules. And under the common rules is the guy that is the transporter has common rules applicable to everybody. There's transparency, there's disclosure, there's uniformity, and there's consistency. So what is he trying to do? He doesn't want to have to negotiate multiple arrangements or agreements with multiple shippers. He doesn't want to begin to dimension okay, let me begin to look at the nuances of this particular instance. No, he develops common rules, almost like the way the most common example I use is in a highway. If you're using a highway, you're traveling from Lagos to Benin or somewhere, there are rules that apply to the highway. It doesn't matter who's using it. It doesn't matter whether your car is coming from Kano or your car is coming from Ibadan going to the east, or from Lagos going to the east. The same rules operate on the highway. So there's a speed limit for every vehicle. There are certain vehicles that are not allowed to pass at certain time. Just exactly what this common carrier model is all about. So the common rules are developed for all the shippers. And as soon as you get into the framework, then what applies to everybody applies to you. So those are sort of like some of the fundamentals. Then finally, I will speak about what I call GTA transportation principles. So there are certain core principles that underpin this GTA we've been talking about. Things around, for example, nomination, gas specifications, allocation and attribution, interruption of deliveries, intershipper liabilities, etc. What are these about? Again, this is critical. And this also flows again from the nature of the commodity itself. Understanding the commodity, both the operational and the commercial realities of the subject matter of an agreement, is more often more critical than any other thing. So rather than focusing more on legal drafting and legal verbiage, the clause should say this, you shouldn't say it. For practical purposes, it's important. Yes, you should understand the legal verbiage, but it's more important to understand the commercial and operational, nuances around the subject matter for which you're drafting an agreement. So things like nomination principles, etc., have all been developed. The gas specs, for example, I mentioned when I started that for a multi-shipper pipeline, multiple shippers will inject their gases into a pipeline to be transported from point A to point B. But you then realize that this gas is coming from, more often than not, different fields, and the specification of the pipe of the gas, even though they would, of course, may have been processed to at least minimum strip out excess sulfur and moisture and to get them to the pipeline specifications. But the specifications will vary. So when they now get into the pipeline, what happens? They will commingle, they will mix together into one common stream. So rules around gas specifications, etc., all set out rules to say, even though we agree that you might have different specs, irrespective of that, the specifications of the gas you want to introduce into this pipeline must fall within a range. And that range is determined based on various factors. More importantly, the range that is most conducive for the pipeline. The pipeline is a physical commodity. It is subject to corrosion and subject to all sorts if you allow gas that doesn't quite meet the specs to get into it. And of course, there are other implications from a commercial basis when you're talking about inert gases, because you don't have a whole lot of volumes, but in terms of the calorific content, you don't really have much. So those rules are to guide all the shippers just to make sure that the gas you're introducing into the system falls within the range. Same thing with the nomination and allocation and attribution. Different people, I bring 10 molecules, you bring 15 molecules, someone else brings 20 molecules, get it into the gas. When it gets in, it comes in together. When it's coming out, remember that the different people will take delivery of their gas at different delivery points, not the same place. There's a metering system to track it, but at the same time, depending on the configuration, sometimes people might pull more or less than they're supposed to pull. So all the rules around making sure that what you put in at the beginning is what you get at the end. If you've just changed somebody else by taking more, once you've taken more, then that means you've taken something belonging to somebody else. Correspondingly, somebody will have to take less. There's no hard and fast rule to it. If 4 of us put in 10 each, and that's 40 commingled, and at the end, I now, instead of taking 10, I take 15 back. The other person, one person will have to take 5. There's no other way to do it. So the rules around managing what gets into the system and what gets out, and then the allocation, and the allocation attribution is allocation as a mathematical formula that determines a ratio as between what was injected into the pipeline and what was received at the delivery point. And then attribution is sort of like a byproduct of that. So given that you put in X and took Y and they correspond, then there's no problem. But however, if you took in X and then you took out Z, meaning you took more, you took less, then attribution is a formula, a mechanism to make sure that you recompense, either because you've taken more than you should have taken or you've taken less. So the parties are made ultimately whole. And that also is also speaking about intershipper liabilities, which is the point I have at the end there. But I think we can speak a little bit more about that in detail when we go on. So before I get to the next segment, I'd just like to ask just for 2 minutes or so, if anyone has any questions or any points to clarify before I just quickly move to the next section?
Does the class have any questions or contributions before Mr. Osuji continues? Kindly note that you can unmute yourself to ask your question. You can unmute yourself and on your video when you want to ask your questions or make your contributions. Do we have anybody? You can also raise your hands.
Okay, so it appears not, so maybe I'll just carry on.
Okay, sir.
Great. So I was speaking to the gas network code. This next section, I'll just talk a little bit about it. So at the beginning, somewhat, at some point, I sort of referred to bilateral arrangements, GTAs, and I sort of also referred to having a sort of code or sort of common principles, carrier principles that relates to gas being transported by a transporter. So sometime in 2020, I think, we introduced the gas transportation network code. And what does that do? The best analogy, again, I can give you is the highway. So the rules are applicable to a highway, a major highway. So the common rules applicable to everybody, how you can enter, what you can drive in. There are places where they have barriers and vehicles or trucks of more than a certain height can cross. There are speed limits, etc., etc. Tolls, in some instances, are introduced. This applies to everybody. So that's pretty much sort of what a network, gas transportation network code sort of does. And this is something that was conceived way back, even when we were looking at the gas master plan, the national gas policy, etc., before it was then eventually codified and published in 2020 by the minister. And for those who have read the Petroleum Industry Act, you see that the PIA also recognizes the network code and says that it relates to transportation, we will continue to apply the code that was issued. So pretty much I don't have a definition for it. There's been questions around what is the code. Some people have asked the question, is this code merely a commercial and operational framework, or is the code a law in terms of being, for example, subsidiary legislation, with force of law, or is it just a commercial and operational framework to which if you then agree to accede to it, it becomes binding on you. But if you don't want to be part of it, you can decide to remain where you are. So those questions have arisen, and I think it's something that I would like to us to reflect upon. Let's just agitate your minds a little bit as we go in these discussions, and then maybe later at the end we can have a discussion about that. So what does the code do? So the code has been set out basically not to apply to every gas transportation arrangements, but to certain major transportation networks. So for example, if you see what we have here, it applies to the ALPS, that's the Scrapos to Lagos pipeline system, applies to the OBEN, also applies to the OB3, as well as other both existing and future gas transportation networks to come up in future, largely run and operated by NGC. NGC, the Nigerian Gas Company, is the transportation network operator for the purposes of the Nigerian Network Code. So I will then move on to exactly. So in this slide, I sort of speak to some of the key principles around the code. And some people will ask, why do you want to have a code? Hitherto, we had signed 10-year, 15-year, 20-year-old gas transportation arrangements with maybe NGC or some transporter. And then suddenly you say we should then have a code. And everybody must then leave his bilateral GTAs and then be party to the code. So, but generally in terms of its philosophy, I've tried to put on the few points. The operator is able to manage the system on a non-discriminatory basis with uniform standard terms. That means, again, like I said at the beginning, uniform terms applies to everybody whose gas is being transported on the pipeline network within the code. Uniform terms. So you don't need to worry that perchance the tariffs you're paying is slightly more than what the next person is paying, or perchance some other person has been offered more favorable treatment than you have, or etc. You don't need to think about that anymore. It's the same uniform terms that applies to everybody. Then all the shippers you have unfettered access to the system. Then, of course, there's a bit of flexibility in the booking and managing capacities by the shippers and the elaborate rules around how that can be done, all the agreements to be signed, et cetera, et cetera. Also, in terms of the monitoring, performances and balances. Remember, at some point in the context of the GTA, I spoke about allocation and attribution and nominations, and all that are set of principles that deal with for each shipper whose gas is being introduced in the pipeline. And what are the volumes that you introduced? Did you get the equivalent volumes at the delivery point? And also, if there's any excess that you took or you took on the deliveries of gas, how are you going to be recompensed for that? So the code purports to take care of all that. So the operator has pretty much visibility over everybody, what's coming in, what's going out, and manages that and has clear rules. You don't need to worry what is being discussed amongst different parties. And the other regime, there are different GTAs, so you have to begin to wonder whether the principles are the same in a manner of speaking. But under the code, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to think about that in a manner of speaking, because everybody has access to the same code. So it's the same rules. So you know what will happen. You know the consequences of what you do, and you know the implications of what you do on the other parties, and I namely mean the shippers within the framework. So that's pretty much what the code, in terms of its philosophy, tries to do. It's a big, elaborate document. Today's discussion is not about the code, but I just sought to introduce it because it is more relevant for parties who have signed GTAs with NGC, for example, because that means that the process has already begun. You would be required to migrate to the code. So understanding the code, how it's going to apply going forward is actually more critical to you, because you will no longer then have to be contending with GTAs, which is this, the specific topic of the presentation. You then have to contend with the code, understand how it works, understand how it varies your right to the GTAs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I thought you introduce this, right? So as it relates to the legal framework, the code is a code, so it's just one document there. However, different people, my company, your company, you want to then accede to the code, you sign what is known as a framework agreement. It's an agreement where you accede to the code. The code becomes binding on you, and all the principles in the code are binding on you, and you can take the benefit of the code, right? So the framework sort of creates that contractual nexus or relationship between the shippers and the operator, right? But it doesn't create any relationship between the shippers. So remember, it's one code for, say, 200 shippers on all the pipelines within the network. When you sign a framework agreement, it creates a relationship between shipper A and the operator of the pipeline. But it doesn't create any relationship between shipper A and shipper B. So that can be dealt with separately. The code just is about the relationship between both parties. I mean, legally speaking, the operator and the transporter, or the operator and the shippers. Though it also deals with a bit of inter-shipper liabilities in terms of dimensioning some of those liabilities, right? So moving on, the code, for those who've looked at it critically, sort of has a what I call a mild exemption regime. So if you've signed the GTA prior to this time, and you would rather not quickly migrate to the code, you can apply to the DPR and ask, and I think you do that through the operator, and ask for the DPR's assent. That's the authority now. It was drafted when it was the DPR. So you apply to the authority and ask for the consent of the authority for you to continue to operate under your bilateral GTA for a period, at least until it expires. However, there are other provisions there that says that all non-code arrangements are expected to be migrated to the code within 6 months of the effective date. Even though an exemption regime has been introduced, this latter provision on the right side of the screen seems to suggest that you have that exemption regime, but there's a sunset date for that. That's even if you can enjoy that exemption, it's only for a period. So within a period, you would have migrated, and that 6 months from the effective date has certainly passed. In terms of implementation, in terms of the migration, it's an ongoing process, but we know that date has passed. So the point really then is that for most parties who have GTAs with the NGC, you really then must begin to think around how your life will then look going forward, because a new document, a new regime has come to place. The code is not radically different from a GTA. It's almost like a big master huge GTA in a manner of speaking. The principles you see in the GTA is the principles you see in the code. So it's not a very unfamiliar document. It's not a very strange document for those who are familiar with the GTA. But it's just that the nuances, the perspectives are slightly different now. The considerations are slightly different. The uniformity, yes, is a good thing, but you then need to be careful because you negotiated a certain deal for yourself when you signed the GTA, but now you then have to contend with the different firm. So those are some of the key considerations. Here I just try to sort of run you through the legislative history, and then, like I said again, in the petroleum, the PIA, it recognizes the code, how it operates to both wholesale gas supply licenses, retail gas supply licenses, and operator licenses, etc. And one key point is that shippers now are required to get a license. So if you're a shipper of gas, you're required to secure a license for your gas to be shipped on any of the transportation networks that falls within the code, amongst other things. So it's just for people to just take that into consideration and bear that in mind. Then there's a little point around the code credit rules, because of course, you know that your GTAs, you talk about your tariffs, you would have written out and try to capture what your tariff, what the philosophy and the methodology would be, what the pricing will be, as well as if you think you want to be able to modify your tariffs, you can introduce an indexation mechanisms so that you, because the GTAs are long-term agreements and the pricing you agreed at the outset might no longer be quite conducive 10 years down the line. You want to introduce an indexation mechanism to enable you to adjust your pricing, etc. So the code has code credit rules, really not about pricing, but I just want to mention that, but code credit rules is about the credit worthiness of the shipper. So it's sort of rules and the basis on which you can be assessed just to make sure you're a credit worthy shipper, because ultimately, as between the operator of the pipeline and the shipper, the operator's critical responsibility to you as a shipper is to transport your pipeline, while your role is to make payments. Once you've delivered the gas, the only other thing you just need to do is to pay for it, pretty much, and then take redelivery at the end. Every other thing is just mechanics. That's just it. So credit rules around your ability to pay is very critical, and that's a critical component of the code, which we just thought to mention. There's a whole body of document that deals with the credit rules, how it's going to be assessed, the form of security to be provided, consequences of the failure to provide these, measures of assessment, etc., etc., etc. All that is set out in there. So it's something we just need to get a bit familiar with, just so we understand how that works. Then I think lastly on the point, I just spoke about what I call value chain considerations. If you recall, at the beginning, I had mentioned that there might be two philosophies. And one of the philosophies is when you begin to look at the GTA as a component of an integrated process. So, just one package of an entire economic model. So it's not just a standoff or standalone concept. So for practical purposes, you would have under your GSA with the customer that you're buying gas from, with the customer you're selling the gas to first and foremost, you would have negotiated the quantities you want to transport, the pricing, key terms to apply, etc., etc., etc. You then quickly run back to the person you want to buy the gas to, negotiate similar terms. Oh, I want to buy 100 million scarf. This is how I want it to be delivered, specs, etc. So you can get the gas to sell. Then you quickly then again run to a transporter and then negotiate a GTA and then say, okay, I'm getting this gas, blah, blah, blah. These are the terms, delivery, etc. You will find a way to make sure the agreements are sort of what we popularly say, they're just sort of back to back. Because if it happens that there's a force majeure event, say either in the gas sale agreement upstream where you're buying the gas or the downstream one, then that force majeure event will affect every other agreement down the chain. Because if the end customer downstream is not taking the gas, then there's nothing to be transported and there's nothing to be bought upstream. So if he's not making payments, because it's the payments that he makes that is used to offset monies due to both the transporter in the middle, which might also include a processing element, as well as the upstream guy through whom the gas is purchased. So you then begin to see there's that interlinkage is sort of almost inextricable and critically important. So when we are then speaking about the code, and parties have prior to this time negotiated GTAs where they took into consideration some of these, what I call value chain effects, the fact that there are multiple agreements which relate to each other. And then you then have to decouple the GTA loan and sign into the code. That means to the extent to which the code changes or varies any of the existing arrangements you had, you then must have to go and renegotiate your existing agreement. That's something that has to be done. There's no way out of it. Alternately, you can then engage with the operators and with the stakeholders to try to find a way within the context of your framework agreement to try to take into consideration some of those other ancillary relationship that you have that will be impacted by significant or wild variances between what you had in your existing GTA and what would be the case if you are ceded to the code. So these are some of the things. For example, the force majeure provisions, you want to make sure that the force majeure provisions are sort of reflected, so that if there's force majeure either upstream or downstream, it is taken into consideration in the midstream. Same thing with contract administration, all sorts of things will sort of be impacted. So those are like practical commercial negotiating points one needs to look at, which is in terms of then for those who are then going to be parties to this code. And of course, we are aware that there's a whole elaborate stakeholder engagement process, which is currently ongoing at the moment. And the industry is trying to, as much as possible, get all the concerns into the room, and then as much as possible, try to negotiate with all the relevant stakeholders, just to take into consideration some of the practical and operational challenges that are somewhat thrown up by the migration. So hopefully all that will be sorted and dealt with. But just important to note that as it relates to those who will then be migrating to the code, part of the key considerations that will underpin your discussions or your negotiations will be how do you then manage all the other arrangements that are, let me not say collateral, but are sort of related to the gas transportation agreements that you've signed. I think I'll come to the end of exactly. So I'll pause again for 30 seconds to see if there's any questions or comments before I quickly move to the last part of the presentation. Then we can then have more time to do question and answer or discussion at the end.
Yes, sir. You have two questions here. One from Mr. Wale Adebi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. One from Mr. Wale Adebi. He wants to know the problem of financing to gas infrastructure in Nigeria. That is, what advice would you give to startups, that is E&P companies?
Yes. So the question says, what advice would you give to startup E&P companies? Oh, yes. Well, okay. So that's
problem of financing gas infrastructure in Nigeria. Now, yes. What advice would you give to startup companies, E&P companies?
Yes, that's a naughty one. Let me try to articulate it as best as I can within the limited space that I have. If you're going to play strictly in the upstream, then you're concerned with, you either have a producing field already or one that you need to explore and start producing. So let's imagine you have a producing field. All you're interested in is in having the right infrastructure to initial capex to start production till you get to first oil. And then afterwards, you then have periodic capex as well as your ongoing OPEX that you need to run your operation to keep on producing. Another key component is then evacuation. So from the field, you need to get the crude oil from the port of production to a point where it can be accessible to either the export market or to whomever you're selling the gas to. So the infrastructure to evacuate the crude or gas that you provide you're producing is critical. So if your field has gas molecules in it, then you, in addition to all the infrastructure you need for your crude and to evacuate it, you then need to set up dedicated infrastructure to be able to gather the gas and to monetize it and evacuate the gas all at the same time. So from a financing point of view, the challenges around this is, let me speak to the crude. The crude is slightly more straightforward. You can always, to the extent to which you've met your DSO obligations, because of course, you will be interposed with a DSO. Sorry, I'm talking of crude first. To the extent to which you can access the export markets, that means you can easily sell your crude to the export market, except you want to sell it domestically. So that means you get a fair price for it. So you can raise your financing. Of course, lenders will do their bankability reviews, look at the infrastructure, look at the value of the reserves, depending on the kind of financing they are thinking about, and then fund, right? Now, if you then, in addition to that, you also then have gas infrastructure you want to then monetize, you then need to get people who will finance the gas infrastructure, and then all the associated infrastructure around evacuating the gas processing will be involved. Maybe you can do third party. So the challenges around it might be quite a lot. If it's gas, to the extent to which the law interposes a domestic supply obligation on you, a good portion of your gas will be channeled to the domestic market. And of course, that's a somewhat regulated market depending on which of the strategic demanding sectors you're supplying to. So price issues begins to come in, and which might affect bankability. So of course, then the value chain effect again is another critical component. Whoever is financing you must ensure or wants to be satisfied that not only can you produce the commodity, but you can commercialize it. So if you're on the E&P end, all the associated infrastructure to make sure you either evacuate, process, and then to sell your crude, you must also, yes, you must also deal with all of this at the same time. If they can't see their way through which you can prioritize and commercialize the process, then it becomes a challenge for you. So you must not only then deal with issues around the financing of the upstream asset itself, but issues around all the associated infrastructure required for you to get it to the market are key considerations. And then given the way the economy is going, of course, we all know what's going on. Energy transition is a key theme now. We now know the increasing reluctance of a good number of both commercial banks, DFIs, to fund particularly crude projects. They take a slightly different view of natural gas projects. So you then begin to see there's going to be constrained funding for E&P activities, and then stricter rules and controls around the requirements, DFI requirements, etc., around funding those assets. So those are challenges you need to contend with. The changing landscape. Crude prices are good at the moment, but crude as a commodity, financing crude is not as attractive as it used to be. So you then begin to have that mix and push in that. So that's sort of the kind of environment you're in for the first question. For the second question.
So Mr. Teji Toye's hand is up. He wants to ask the question. Mr. Teji, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much to the facilitator. I was hoping that you are at some point going to get to the relationship between suppliers, between the suppliers themselves. In terms of, we've seen that the typical nature of the agreement is between supplier and then transporter. But because of the nature of the infrastructure, there's commingling and all of that, rights could, be affected and all of that. Now, just like in finance, where you have intercreditor agreements, common terms, and all of those things that bring parties that would ordinarily, that ordinarily do not have privity, are there, within the context of the gas transportation agreements, are there like supply agreements or shipper agreements, where you can then begin to resolve those relationships, in terms of, the risky behavior of a particular shipper, affecting the right of another, even if there is no strict, within the conventional framework, if there is no strict privity between them. Do you resolve that in terms of some agreements where they can then go after one another, other than the transporter themselves?
Okay, thank you very much. As you rightly pointed out in concluding, there really is no privity between the shippers because it's bilateral between the transporter and the shipper. In the context of the GTA, we call them shippers, not suppliers. So there's really no privity. So you can, as a shipper A, you can't compete against shipper B for something that's done wrong. However, most GTAs have rules around managing the relationship or the implications of what one shipper has done vis-a-vis another shipper. So clearly the GTA will recognize as a multi-shipper pipeline in the first instance. Clearly the GTA will, in more instances, sometimes in separate arrangements, sometimes in the same GTA, have these things that I've called, apart from your nomination, your allocation and attribution principles. And what does it do? So if I would have liked to sort of give you sort of what the chart looks like. So it's a principle that recognizes that three shippers, A, B, C, are putting in 10, 15, 20 molecules of gas at the initial point. And these are the specs of the gas. First, the transporter will make sure that as it relates to the specifications of the gas, for example, given contamination risks and risk of going off spec, you cannot introduce gas that is off spec. If you introduce gas that is off spec, then there will be consequences. And what those consequences will do is that there will be penalties from levied on you by the transporter on account of you introducing off spec gas. That's at the outset. But almost immediately, the transporter will deny you access to the pipeline so that you don't continue to bring in that off-spec gas. So what are we trying to do to mitigate the risk by stopping you from introducing it? Then in terms of the consequences, the penalties, it will sort of be liquidated. The damages the transporter will ask you for. If there is any damages, any liabilities arising in consequence, either in account of damage to physical infrastructure of the pipelines, or damage to associated facilities, or any liabilities arising in consequence of introduction of off-spec gas, you'll be liable for it. So you will see that behind this veil is other shippers. So if other shippers' gas are now adversely impacted by the fact that you introduced off-spec gas, the liabilities that the transporter will claim for you will be used to, because under their own arrangements, the other shippers' arrangements with the transporter will have to pay him liabilities for giving him off-spec gas. So what will happen is that I put in off-spec gas that messes up your own gas. Under your own GTA, you will sue the transporter for giving you off-spec gas. Under the GTA between the transporter and myself, he will sue me for damages and losses he suffered. I will pay damages to him or pay some liquidated damages to him. He will use part of it and settle you under your GTA. So you see in that mechanism, without creating a direct recourse or a collateral contract between both parties, but there's a mechanism to address that issue. Same thing happens to, in the context of the allocation and attribution mechanism, which deals with the volumes. If you have done sort of what is known as an overrun, which is that you have taken more gas than you should have taken or overtaken. You've taken more gas than you should have taken, meaning that someone else will take less gas. That means there's a deficit. They have this balancing mechanism in the context of the GTAs and in the attribution framework, where they will now, either in terms of what volumes you can take subsequently or payment or something, but you will make do for the gas you've taken. So if, again, as between myself as a shipper and yourself as a shipper, I've taken more gas, resulting in you then taking less gas than you're entitled to, that mechanism will, that adjustment will occur within the framework of my GTA, so I can repay the gas I've taken. In the context of your own GTA with that same transporter, because it also has that balancing mechanism, it will do that adjustment. So, but I can't see your GTA, so it's in the negotiation of your own GTA. You just have to make sure that you have enough belts and braces to ensure that all the negative implications of the operations or activities of any other third party, including the shipper on the pipeline, is properly addressed. So if you're in the context of a common carrier framework or a network code, these entire principles are all in the code. Everybody sees it. So you then know this is exactly how it works and how it's dealt with. So as you rightly said, yes, no direct privilege of contract, but there's a mechanism to sort of address, or at the minimum, mitigate the adverse implications of one shipper's activity vis-a-vis the other guy. I don't know if that assists before I move on.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Konji, will you like you ask your question yourself, or should I read it out to the speaker? Mr. Adeyinka Konji, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. He's answered the question in the course of the lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we also have Miss Diana Abbasi. She's asking you a question. Diana, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question, or should I ask it on your behalf?
You can ask it, but maybe I can just ask it myself since I'm already unmuted.
Okay.
You can hear me. I joined a bit late. I'm not sure.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I think it may have been covered, but I just want clarity. So the network code was said to have commenced in 2020, if I recall well, but I don't know if it has actually come into effect or existence, if there are already transactions going on under it, and what does that look like in practical realities? Are there challenges? What does it look like? Because I remember at the time they're back and forth as to the actual outworking of what it will look like, and it didn't seem like there was a straightforward headway. So that's what the question is.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'd sort of spoken a little bit around some of the points, but in terms of effectiveness, it's effective. It started, and I think the few shippers who have already signed on to the network code, not people that are migrating, but new people, new entrants who had already, I think so. I think that's correct. Who've already signed on to the network code at the moment, so they're operating on that basis. But again, as I said, they are sort of, because soon after it was rolled out, of course, it was realized that there were a few operational issues to sort of tinker around and work around. So those discussions, those stakeholder engagements are still ongoing. The framework was sort of set, put in place to have stakeholders come together to, put their thoughts on the table and then just to find common ways of addressing all those points. So that engagement is still ongoing. And what it's doing is focusing particularly on persons who already have in existing arrangements. Not just them, but pretty much them, because already their positions are already fixed in stone, so they don't need to alter some of their positions. So they have brought to the fore some of the challenges that they are having, and that engagement is an ongoing process to try to address that. So I think, like I said, the code is in force, in effect, but in terms of full implementation, it's not as if a hammer, a gavel was hit on the table and says, everybody must now join today. No, I think in terms of the operationalization, there's sort of that, I call it a transition regime, almost like what you have in the PIA, which allows persons who have existing OMS and OPLs to continue to operate under the old regime, at least till they decide to convert. So there's sort of a transitionary regime for parties to just sort of work through all what the issues are, then they can comfortably sign their framework agreements and migrate. So in terms of the challenges, oh, sorry, I forgot that. I think from where I sit, I'm just a lawyer, just in case the operators in the house will have better understanding of what all the operational challenges are. But from where I sit, what I think the greatest challenges for those who have signed an existing GTA is trying to align your existing operations with the requirements of the code. So let me just give you a common example. If you sign the GTA where you pay, let's say, just 2 tariffs, for example, or 2 components, and now you pay 3 components, you then begin to look at both from a cost-benefit analysis and even in terms of the mechanics, how you're going to adjust that. Something as minor as your invoicing, very minor, will have to change to then recognize that you have 3 or 4 components under your invoices to be paid. If your protocol for being able to make nominations in your bilateral agreement is separate from what the code contemplates in terms of how you can then book your capacity both at the delivery and the delivery point, you then need to begin to, so there's quite of operationalization that needs to be done. So some of them are really much about getting more comfortable and in tune with the new regime, but some of them might have a bit more fundamental implication in terms of the fact that rights and obligations were created on the back of certain assumptions. So those assumptions, when they then change, you then need to wonder how to deal with them. If you have a pure bilateral GTA that has no value chain implications, and by that I mean doesn't impact on any GSA that you've signed or whatever, then it's easier for you. But if you then have signed GSAs or other agreements on the back of the GTA or vice versa, then in negotiating or trying to get comfortable with the code, you must then also look at the implications on this other arrangement. But it's something, like I said, that is ongoing and hopefully should be sorted out soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let me proceed quickly. And then again, like I said, in the course of this last part, I'll pause from time to time and then invite questions or discussion. So here I will move very quickly because I've spoken pretty much around this. I've introduced who the parties are. In terms of the structure of your GTA, when you sign most of these agreements, it's not when they start. Because what typically happens, and we'll talk about financing and implications. Somebody asked me a question on financing. You want to start a project, even to develop the pipeline itself, to construct it. At the back of the construction of the pipeline, you then have to enter into arrangements, your financing arrangements, your EPC, etc., and you develop the pipeline, it starts working. For the shipper then wants to engage you to use your pipeline. Your pipeline is operational. Of course, he has a project he's using the gas molecules, the revenue from the gas molecules for. So he will sign a GTA with you. The GTA will then commit both parties to then begin to take certain steps. On the back of a signed GTA, he can then go and raise financing, of course, but lenders will typically even want to be involved in the negotiation of the GTA. They want to be sure that, for example, they might have things known as step-in rights that enables a lender to step in quickly if something has gone wrong and the shipper cannot perform. They want to see how the liquidated damages are dealt with. They want to look at all the payment triggers and all those conditions and terms subject to which parties can say we are not doing again. And then if they say we're not doing again, what happens? I've already lent you $200 million and you said you're not doing again. How do I get my money back? So a lender is interested in all that. So you then begin to see from a regulatory point of view, regulator wants to make sure all the permits and licenses are in place. Remember, as we said now, under the PIA, etc., shippers need to get a license. So all the regulatory permits, etc., are key conditions before the thing actually starts. Then, of course, depending on where you're getting your gas from, you need to be able to do a bit of interconnection of the upstream facilities to get the gas into the inlet point. So all that whole arrangement needs to be in place amongst so many other things before parties can then actually kickstart the obligations for me as a shipper to provide the gas to you and for you to transport it. So between the execution of the agreement and what is known as a start date, some people call it commercial operations date, there's a whole host of conditions that are supposed to be met. That's all the CPs. And then everything is commissioned and then we can start. So when all that is in place, then the GTA effectively starts. And by the GTA, I mean the point where irrevocably the right of the transporter to transport gas and the right of the shipper to pay for the gas arises. Before then, the right hasn't really kickstarted. It is only on that point, which might be the effective date, might be the start date, depending on what you call it, those rights then crystallizes. And what it does is to get parties to a state of both commercial and operational readiness before they really start performing. Because when you start, it's difficult to backtrack. So it just helps them to get ready before the start. So that's what you have the CPs for. The rest around payment security is quite straightforward. For the shipper, his obligation is to pay for the gas, but we know from time to time there are cash flow issues. So for example, I gave an example where you're supplying to somebody downstream and it's when he pays you that you pay. Then he doesn't pay, he goes bust. Or the guy you're supplying downstream, you contracted to give him 100 million scope. And then he wakes up because he's producing something that the market doesn't want again. So he either has to stop producing entirely or curtail the volumes he needs and says, I no longer want 100 million scope, I want 30. You then run into a pickle because you had negotiated the GTA with somebody to supply you 100. Now the guy says he wants 30. So you see, there might be issues. There might be the legal issues, but there's also the practical issues. And even if you carry that guy, or it doesn't matter what you do to him, gone to the job, he just doesn't have money to pay for 100. So you then begin to have issues. Sometimes it may not be liquidity issues, solvency issues. I mean, sometimes it's merely cash flow issues, cash flow management issues. It's not coming as you should. So a transporter will want you to have, a payment security in place. And what does that do? It's to externalize your payment risk. So if for some reason you don't have cash to pay, you can immediately draw on that security. It could be in the form of a letter of credit or a bank guarantee. Once in a while, you begin to see people ask for maybe parent company guarantee, but it's not so common because that again depends on the credit risk and worthiness of the parent company. So pretty much you want an instrument from a financial institution, like a letter of credit or a corporate, or a sort of, what do you call it, or a guarantee or some sort of bond to make sure that the man can, the shipper can pay for his obligations. Points around custody, title delivery points, I've already spoken of at the beginning, so no need to go through that again. I've also spoken a little bit around the quantities, points around capacity reservation, which is pretty much most of the frameworks you have under the GTA. You have a reserved capacity that you pay for, and when you do that, you no longer have a ship or pay commitment. There's no need for it because the reservation of the capacity itself is a guarantee of that income. So whether you then wake up and say, shipper, okay, transport gas or not, that's your business. You must pay him that reserved capacity. Whether you bring gas for him to transport for you or not, you pay for it. So there's minimum, guaranteed income for him, and it's very critical for a transporter because those incomes have people at the back that are looking for it. Lenders are looking for it. He needs to run his OPEX. He needs to settle all sorts of things. So he needs that minimum guarantee. So that really is about quantities. Then, of course, you have a nomination protocol that takes about, even though you have indicated at the beginning, you sort of set out a forecast, a monthly, 6 monthly or weekly forecast of the quantities you will need. But on a daily basis, generally, you then have to do your nominations to say on this day, I'm bringing slightly more, slightly less, subject to the tolerance limits. And then so all that principle around the volumes you can actually transport are all dealt with in the quantities and nomination provisions in your GTA, as well as consequences where you underperform or you overperform in a manner of speaking. So this sort of, we should be talking about ship or pay here, and I've sort of, spoken about it. So there's something I mentioned about capacity, the reserved capacity. There are certain agreements where you have what's called tradable capacity. So I, as a shipper, has built capacity which I have to pay for. But a magnanimous transporter might allow me, in certain instances, to trade it to somebody else. So that maybe for some reason I no longer have gas for a month. Maybe because I'm undergoing maintenance in my upstream, so there's no gas coming in. I can trade it to another shipper to use my capacity. Or I can even sublet my capacity to someone else to use. And what does that help to do? It just helps to make sure that that relationship continues to flow. Even though I don't have my gas, somebody else's gas can come in any event, I'm liable to pay for it. And then, of course, there's a bit of dimensioning. Parties will then the shipper will try to argue, if I don't have, why don't I pay less? Why must I pay? transporter will argue on the conversely, depending on where you're sitting as a lawyer or as a party, that nonetheless you still have to pay, right? And so that whole concept of your ship on pay obligation, which is tied to your reserve capacity, is almost like your take or pay obligation on the GSA. So if you have signed the GSA, you would try to match your take or pay obligation to your ship or pay obligation. So what does that mean? Under the GSA, you've committed that you're going to take at a minimum 70% of an annual or monthly or daily contract quantity. 70%. So it doesn't matter what happens, you always take and pay for 70%. You go here and negotiate also under your GTA for the same sort of volumes, so that you make sure that at each time you have a guarantee here and there's a guarantee here. So it's sort of back to back, so it doesn't change. So you're not in a scenario where you've already committed to the transporter that at the minimum you will transport 80. But meanwhile, your take or pay here or something is 60, and then there's a mismatch of 20. So that balancing act is also something that needs to be done pro rata. I also mentioned a few things around the interruptible shippers, but I think I'll talk about that later on. Makeup gas, pretty much also in the context of GSAs, but also relating to gas transportation arrangements. And what I'm talking about here is, or sometimes talk about the carry forward element. So what happens in an instance in which you have made your ship or pay or capacity payment, but no gas was transported? You have a right in the subsequent period to be able to have that your capacity used to transport gas for you. So you get a corresponding right to use the facilities for the payment you've made. But in the context of a GSA, it's quite simple. So it's slightly simpler. So if I've paid for 20 molecules of gas, which I didn't take for some reason, next year I can say, okay, the 20 I paid for, I have a makeup entitlement. So give me 20 molecules. Well, for transportation, the man simply books capacity for you. So if he booked capacity for you for 20 and you didn't transport 20, the next year, it might be difficult for you to ask him to give you free capacity for 20 for the money you've paid. Quite difficult. Occasionally, sometimes most transporters are unable or unwilling to do so. So you then begin to discuss the trade-off. What are you going to do? Are you going to ask for him to adjust your tariff for the following year, or to then adjust your ship or take quantity for the following year, so you have less quantities that you must ship and pay for? So you just do sort of a balancing. So those are some of the operational things, and some of these things actually have practical implications. It's possible that a transporter is himself within a relationship with another gas sale or gas transportation arrangement, through which he secures either his own gas to sell, or through which he manages other shippers. So the extent to which you're trying to get him to change for you, the transporter must at all times keep a firm view on the entire gamut of relationships that he has, to make sure that he's balancing it in a way that he doesn't sell himself short. Because how can he guarantee that he's able to give you the capacity that you didn't take this year, the following year, without impacting on someone else? So all those are discussions that really come within the context of that. And the ability to negotiate it is also a function of transparency, taking into consideration the operational nuances, and then looking at really what is practicable for the parties. And sometimes if it can be dealt with in money, either by reducing or discounts to the tariffs, then it's much easier for the parties to do that. Same thing also applies to the carry forward concept, which are related to the GSA. Now, commingling, allocation, and attribution I've already discussed in earlier segments. Here, I just tried to talk about tariffs, just principles around the tariffs, and I've discussed capacity payment, which is pretty much applicable where you have capacity reservation-based GTA. So when you have that, then you make a capacity payment for that volume that capacity has been reserved for you. So that's just pretty much it. Sorry, for the capacity that has been reserved for you, you have a dedicated capacity payments to make for that. Clean. Then some are, I also mentioned two variants. There's a quantities-based GTA, which is much uncommon. For that, you just make tariffs. But more often than not, you have a hybrid, which you make a capacity payment, and then you also pay tariffs. So two of them, you then begin to have components relating to your capacity payments, and components relating to your tariffs, and those where you have to pay. So from a transporter's point of view, why do you want capacity payments? Why do you want ship or pay stipulations to apply? Why do you want guaranteed income to the detriment of the shipper, in a manner of speaking? Those things go to things like maintaining your infrastructure costs, either recovering your earlier invested infrastructure cost or cost of ongoing maintenance of your infrastructure, your OPEX, and a bit of that will come within your OPEX. That's your operating expenditure needed to maintain the pipeline, run it, maintain it, pig it from time to time, etc., and including all the associated infrastructure, your metering system, depending on how elaborate it is. You may want to have a SCADA, etc. And then, of course, you want to have a fair return. And your fair return is on the back of if there's been any lendings that supported your ability to set up your pipeline infrastructure. You need to pay your lenders first. So they get a first line charge on your tariffs. And then ultimately, if there's anything left, then you get a marginal or minimal return. So that's really the philosophy why your transporter would keep insisting on having capacity payments, and then for having a GTA to have capacity reservation built into the mix, right? Then in terms of the tariff, there are various models, but I won't go to that. The postage stamp tariff is pretty much one that is paid irrespective of the distance. So you pay a tariff for transporting certain molecules. So whether I'm moving the gas from here to Ikoyi, that's where my delivery point is for you. Or whether I'm taking it further to Lekki, I pay the same tariff per molecule. So that means if you adopt the postage stamp tariff methodology, it's beneficial for shippers who are moving gas from long distances because they'll pay the same tariff as somebody who's moving it in the shorter distances paying. Meaning that if somebody is taking delivery of the gas at the Lekki Free Trade Zone, he will pay the same tariff as somebody who's taking it in VI, for example. So, but you don't see a whole lot of that. You don't have zonal tariffs, and that's pretty much where you have long pipelines that are broken up into zones. So within this, but let's say area pipeline from this point to this point, different tariff, between these points to a different, slightly different tariff, etc. Not so common in the system. Then you also have volumetric tariffs, and then you have interruptible payments. Concept of interruptible arrangements. Maybe I should just speak about that a bit. Most of your GTAs or GSAs or most product supply arrangements are on a firm capacity basis. So you go and you contract for something, agree, this is the volume I will take, and I must take a minimum volume, and these are the consequences for not taking it. So it's all arranged. Everything is tied together. But you don't have an interruptible arrangement, which might be a standalone or on the back of an existing firm capacity arrangement. What's interruptible? I can come and say, between ourselves, we agreed that I order buy and you sell to me, or I will give you to ship for me or transport for me 100 molecules. However, from time to time, I might have additional 20 molecules to transport. When I have that 20, I will come to you and say, I have 20 to transport. Can you transport it for me? You will look at it and come back to me and say, okay, I can transport it. And then we carry on. If I don't have, you won't come and say to me on like the firm commitment, why didn't you bring 20? In the same way, even if I say I have 20 to transport, I can't force you to transport it for me. It's for you to agree. So that is in a very simplistic manner, an interruptible arrangement. Because what it does is that it doesn't have that firm long-term commitment over a period. So I may decide from time to time I give you, or for a period, or even have an interruptible for a period. For 6 months, I have an interruptible arrangement. But it's based on endeavor basis, slightly higher, or reasonable endeavor basis, the contractual obligations. One party will reach out to the other and say, transport volumes for me. The other party will say, okay, I can. And then you transport, you compute the numbers and payment is made. So that's a more flexible arrangement and we have seen instances where on the basis of a firm arrangement, parties will even negotiate on top of it interruptible arrangements for additional volumes so that in anything in excess of the firm commitments, they can then flow into an interruptible regime, which will be, let me just call it reasonable endeavor basis. To the extent to which I can, I will ask you to provide me your transportation services, and to the extent to which you can, you will then provide the transportation services to me, and every other thing flows from there. So that's sort of an interruptible regime. Comes in various variants, but I've just tried to explain one of the simpler constructs in terms of its applications. Then, of course, we have here overrun charges. And what's that? That's when a shipper overruns its nominated capacity. What's overrun? You delivered 100 to be transported for you. But at the end, you now took 120. You've taken more than you're supposed to take. So that's an overrun. Now, practically speaking, and depends on the configuration of both the pipeline and the associated infrastructure, there's a way gas works. There's a bit of a push from the transporter's end, using all these compressors and everything, and it's pumping the gas with high pressure and speed to get across the distance of the pipeline. From the guy that is taking the gas at the delivery point, remember it's coming at a certain pressure on the pipeline. If it hits his facilities at that pressure, to spoil it. So you have facilities, state meters and etc. things that will sort of take enable you to accept it at the right pressure and volumes that can then take it to the facilities where it's supposed to be delivered. Some of these things, sometimes they pull the gas. I don't understand it that very well, or, I'm just a lawyer, as I mentioned, but let's just put it this way, that sometimes they pull the gas. And what does that mean? So he's sort of like sucking the gas at that point. So even though you agreed 100, he might suck more than 100 and take 110 or 120. So for the perspective of the shipper, he has had an overrun. He's taking more than he should take. So the GTA will then also provide what happens if you take an overrun. And like I said, anytime you do an overrun, more often than not, that means another shipper is going to have less gas because it's somebody's gas that you took. So how that is dealt with is balanced, is dealt with in that agreement. For the prudent shipper, in his GSA with the person he's supplying gas to, he will then have overtake provisions. Overtake is the corresponding, it's like the handshake of an overrun. So between a shipper and a transporter is called an overrun because I took more. Between me and the person I'm supplying, it will be overtake provisions. It's taking more than they should have taken. So I will say under the GTA, I will say for overrun, I as shipper will say I'll pay you a premium for the overrun gas. Then I'll go to my GSA for the fellow that actually took that over gas. For the overtake that you took, you will pay me a premium. So that means when the GTA guy, the transporter comes knocking on the door and said, pay me your overrun charges, I will go under the GSA and knock on the door for the person I sold the gas to. Pay me your overtake charges. He gives me the 10 cents or $10. I take it and pass it over to the other guy. That way, as a shipper, I'm made whole. So depending on where you sit, where you're negotiating from, it's important to understand these concepts. But it's first important to understand the practicality of how it works. If you understand how it works, then you can then easily begin to see why a transporter will want to have overrun provisions in agreement and why you should have overtake provisions in your own agreement. Because from a practical point of view, it's not like exact, it's not like delivering a cube of certain dimensions. They will more often than not be slightly, a bit of overages going across the system, right? Or maybe the gas might even just escape. So you have to then build that into the mechanisms. But most important is to identify the concern, the risk, and then to allocate it appropriately in a way that you yourself or your client does not suffer excessive impact on account of that. So moving to the next one. But I think we're getting to the end. So these are more of sort of boilerplate type provisions. And here I speak about the hardship and price review provisions. Now remember I said most of these commodity type arrangements, long-term agreements, 10 years. Lately in the industry, not just in Nigeria, globally, people are beginning to see shorter-term agreements. Even in the LNG market, you begin to see shorter-term agreements. Like before, you used to have long-term, very long-term agreements. And those are for various reasons. There are also a whole lot of issues behind that. But I won't spend too much time on that. Important thing to know is that you will have a hardship provision that what it does is to introduce a mechanism where parties whose circumstances, financial circumstances in particular, where parties whose financial circumstances have changed will then have a framework to renegotiate the pricing to deal with the impact of the changed financial circumstances. That's just a way to summarize it. So we signed an agreement based on certain base assumptions. Then further down the line, 5 years, certain things change. The pricing now becomes incredibly unrealistic for the transporter, maybe because the operation cost, there's inflation has gone up, Naira has moved against the dollar, getting access to facilities, everything has just gone crazy. So he can no longer collect a tariff that is collected. He needs double the money. Or for the shipper himself, things have changed. Then the hardship arrangement is an arrangement, rather than parties just go to war and guns blazing, it enables you to come together to then say, okay, given this set of facts, and it's usually narrowly defined, and you typically relates to financial impact on the circumstances on you guys. Of course, you can change it, but pretty much parties would like to limit it to that. So to that extent, because of course you have your force majeure provisions, which deals with other impacts that you can handle, but hardship is separate. You can then renegotiate, right? Then of course I mentioned things I called permissible exclusions from performance, things like your maintenance, force majeure, and operational safety. The last one is an HSC point, typically even by law, when they are on accounts of operational safety, both for the human beings and the facilities and the environment. There are certain actions that an operator is required to take, including shutting down the facilities preemptively, immediately. Whether he serves you immediate notice or not, he can shut it down And that's because of the wider implications of that, either on safety to welfare, well-being, or life, or even the environment. So the transporter can take certain activities in that regard. And if you look at things like the network code, you also see elaborate provisions in that regard. Force majeure is quite straightforward, and those are permissible, legally agreed circumstances where parties can decide to be exempted or excluded from the obligations to perform. And what is force majeure? Force majeure really pretty much are contractual mechanisms that enables parties to sort of sidestep the effect of frustration and contract. Because traditionally speaking, frustration as a common law principle would operate to entitle the party to walk away from a contract. In which case, it's not like a rescission where you can recoup. You walk away, right from where you are, everything, you just drop the pen and you walk away. But sometimes the implications of walking away might be quite devastating. So a force majeure provision enables you to sit down and agree, these are the circumstances under which I can walk away. This is how I can walk away. This is how long I can stay despite that event before I can then decide to walk away. And this is what happens afterwards. So it's almost like an orderly exit that enables you to work through what you need to work through in the contract before you step away from it. Maintenance, of course, these are operational requirements. From time to time, facilities need to be maintained. Either the pipeline needs to be maintained, or even the facility of the person supplying the gas needs to be maintained. So you will pre-agree and then synchronize and have, even before signing the GTA, you have discussions amongst yourselves where you will agree and share amongst yourselves your respective maintenance schedules. So you know between June and July, I'll be doing maintenance. So as much as possible, the intention is to synchronize it. So there's no point in June and July, I'm doing my own maintenance and you're not doing yours, but nothing can happen because I'm maintaining. Then in September, you start yours. Meanwhile, I'm ready. Then that means ultimately we've lost 2 months. But to the extent to which we can overlap or synchronize our maintenance schedules, that means we can both agree, maintain your facilities in June to July, and I'll do the same for mine. So while I'm maintaining mine, you're maintaining yours. Then we all stay within a 30-day gap so that we can limit the period of downtime on account of maintenance. That's pretty much what it's all about. It's unavoidable. There's nothing you can do about maintenance. You just have to manage the scheduling, the reporting, and then to look at the implications of maintenance. And sometimes they may be totally inability to perform. Sometimes you just reduced capacity to perform. So you make sure you carefully outline what the implications of maintenance will be, how long it's supposed to last for, what happens if it exceeds that period. And then you also deal with things known as exceptional maintenance. Those are things that you did not plan or schedule, or something happens and then you just need to do it at the moment. What are the implications? What is the impact on the parties? And what do the parties get to do? Then, of course, I was speaking about interconnection provisions, interconnected provisions, which is when I was talking about having a value chain effect, looking at the implications of one agreements and others. And I don't think to go into that. This, I think, is my last slide. So this pretty much just a whole lot of other boilerplates. You deal with your termination events, your triggers, termination payments, limitation of liabilities, indemnities, assignments, whether you can assign, governing law, your gas specs, etc., etc. So all these are pretty much negotiated between the parties, and as a whole, even though people call them boilerplates, and some people seem to take the view it doesn't really matter, but everything matters in an agreement, and there is a reason why something is written in a particular way. You may think something as, I don't even know what to call as ephemeral, as invoicing and payment doesn't matter. Then you then find out that the invoicing and payment regime, if not carefully drafted and taken into consideration, the practical realities of the parties can just mess one of the parties up. So, but the important thing is just to note that though we are often told from the operators in the market that the most important element is the commercials. That once you have the pricing and the quantities sorted out, every other thing is easy. But from practical experience, yes, parties then do get into a bit of a contest around some of these things. And then you begin to then know how to dimension. Things like termination payments and termination triggers are important, particularly from a bankability point of view, and particularly when there are lenders on the table. Because a lender will carefully review the termination triggers. He may not want the transporter to be able to terminate under certain circumstances. No. Even if you have the right to terminate, the consequences of the termination and the termination payments that will accrue, he will then be, train it with a very fine tooth comb. You, in addition, want things like step-in rights. These are instances where he will be able to step in. And this will be tied to collateral arrangements known as, direct agreements. which is an arrangement that you sign for either the off-taker or the shipper or the transporter, saying, I know that my shipper, this shipper that you signed the GTA might mess up or something goes wrong. If he messes up, allow me as a lender to step into his shoes and continue to pay you. Just so he maintains the integrity of that relationship, because that relationship is integral to the lender continuing to receive payments under maybe some facility or one arrangement or the other. So, like again, this is just sort of a nuance to it. So sometimes it's just the parties on the table that are negotiating an arrangement, and more often than not, that's easier. More often than not, it's not the case. Behind the parties, you have a whole host of stakeholders. If they are sponsors to a project, they have their own considerations and they are thinking about how does this impact on us. If they are lenders, the lenders are the most, the strongest, let me not use the word pervasive group in the room, and they are pushing very strongly, so bad that if you run ahead to finish negotiating your agreements before the lenders come in, more often than not, they will require you to open up the agreements again. And you won't have a choice. It's their money that will fund the project. So if you say, oh, lenders can then bugger off, then that's your business. When they come, they won't give you your money. So you see that something like understanding the entire universe of all the stakeholders within the room, even the regulators are a key stakeholder to this arrangement, how they fit into the relationship, whether there are certain components of it, for example, tariffs that are regulated. And then that means in dimensioning your tariffs, for example, if you're in a gas processing arrangement, the intention is now to regulate the gas processing fee or just to put a cap to it. So that means you must negotiate within the context of that, of the regulatory intervention into your purely commercial remit. So those are important things to bear in mind in negotiating, not just in terms of what the documents say, but a better understanding of how the relationship of the parties, bilateral seats, as well as all the interlinkages and all the other relationships that flow around it. So I think I'll stop at this point and then take any comments or questions that may come. So back to you, Rakiba. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful presentation. It was enlightening, and I am sure we all learned a lot from your presentation. It was really beautiful. Just to give a brief recap, one moment, please. Mr. Osuji, I'm trying to stop your video sharing.
Okay, I think I can stop sharing.
So that, yeah, yes. Thank you.
Has it stopped?
Yes, it has. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right.
It has stopped. So just to give a brief recap of what Mr. Osuji gave us, of Mr. Osuji's presentation. He started by giving us an overview of a gas transportation agreement, where he showed us the critical components of a natural gas value chain. He later enlightened us on the quantity or capacity-based mechanism in a gas transportation agreement. Then he showed us how the title and risk is allocated, the philosophy and system rules, and the typical pipeline system principles, such as the nomination principles, gas specification, allocation and attribution, interruption of deliveries, and the intershipper liabilities. He then went ahead to enlighten us about the Nigerian Gas Transportation Network Code, where he discussed the key code principles, the agreement framework, non-code arrangements, the licensing regime, code credit rules, and the gas value chain consideration. Finally, Mr. Osuji gave us the general provisions that is expected to be present in a gas transportation agreement, such as the condition precedent and commissioning, payment security, title, custody, and risk, or the delivery points, the parties, the take or pay provisions, etc. It also showed us the other provisions to note, such as maintenance, gas specification, invoicing and payment, force majeure, assignment and transfer, liabilities and indemnities, to mention a few. Kindly note that Mr. Osuji has promised to send us a draft agreement before the end of the week, and we will upload it with the other materials on Google Drive link sent to your registered email. So Mr. Osuji, before I take a question, someone sent us a question here, but before I introduce the person, I would like to just know that these principles you showed us in your presentations, are they applicable to drafting other agreements such as the CNG, the JOAs, and LPG sales agreements?
Okay, well, thanks, Rakiva. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir.
Okay, great. Well, to a large extent, yes. Most of the fundamental principles apply, but there are then nuances that apply to different things. So I'll give you an example. For the CNG, the commodity itself is transported separately, differently from pure natural gas in liquid form. So it's compressed and put in all those 12-foot or 15-foot or 20-foot canisters, and more often than not moved by trucks from point A to point B. You then have even some of your modular, very small LNGs that are also moved in a similar fashion. So that means in trying to dimension, the delivery itself is different. One is purely by pipeline, where the man just pushes it through a pipeline and then it gets to the other end. One is moved through a truck. It gets to your facilities. More often than not, he just leaves the canisters in your facilities. You will discharge it depending on how fast you're able to use it. And then you return the empty canisters. Then maybe every 2 weeks, you replace them. So that sort of also affects a few of the nuances, not a lot of things. Most of the provisions will apply, but provisions around commissioning, infrastructure, maintenance, delivery, the kind of impact that might happen might then be changed. So in the context of, say, your CNG transportation agreement, the nuances might just be slightly different on account of the fact of how the commodities are mixed. In addition, because those CNGs, for example, are physically able to be moved through trucks, it's somewhat slightly easier to find an alternative market for them. So I want to deliver to a particular facility in Ibeshe, and for some reason he can't take it. I can ask around for any other communities around there who have CNG reception facilities. That's another key point. We then need to build the reception facilities and then move it there, or even keep it and not move it. But natural gas in its pure gas form is difficult. You don't have that flexibility at all. You just don't have the flexibility at all. So what you can do sort of also then affects, but generally in terms of the broad mechanics and the framework, that agreement, that structure applies to all the other variants, generally speaking. So I don't know if that clarifies.
Okay, yes, it does. Thank you, sir. So Mr. Deji, Toye's hand is up. Can you please unmute yourself, Mr. Deji, so that you can make your intervention? Please go ahead, sir. Mr. Deji.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know that you called me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You raised your hand to ask a question.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Mr. Osuji, for the very, very, illuminating and enlightening presentation. I want to ask in respect of hardship clauses, what would be the typical elements that you will index the prices to, where you are then going to send the threshold, inflation, Forex, and all of that? What will be typical, for, in a GTA that you will index it to, for the purpose of determining when you can then renegotiate or how you can renegotiate your pricing? Thank you.
Okay, let me just put it this way. Indexation is applies slightly differently. Your indexation, if you want to have any, will be in your pricing clause, in your tariff, or either your pricing clause for your GSA or your tariff for your GTA. So you index it maybe to some other commodity or other product, or maybe CPI or something. And then you run based on that. You can use CPI or something, and then you index it. And what that does is that your pricing automatically keeps a component of your pricing automatically keeps getting adjusted as the index changes. So your prices generally becomes a bit more, let me call it commercially relevant or in tune with commercial realities. Now, the hardship is a separate thing altogether. Maybe something has happened to you which affects you separately and results in financial impact. Something else, it might be an external thing, and it's not necessarily just about the price review clause. So this is something else that has happened. And what you generally do there, you don't set out the framework with indexation. I must also mention, sometimes I find it, I try to be careful of setting out general propositions in contract drafting, because what works for A is not always what works for B, and there's no Bible for it. But generally speaking, what you try to achieve in hardship provisions is first to recognize that certain limited events which result in certain limited impacts, like I said, financial, might have an effect. Then you set a framework for the parties to come and negotiate. You don't set the parameters of the negotiation for them. You don't set the outcomes of the negotiation on the basis, because at that point, you can't even predetermine what is the impact or what cost it or how it's going to land. So you just provide a forum for orderly negotiation. And then you can go ahead to say, if they can agree, this is what will happen. More often than not, dispute resolution will set in. Or if they can agree, on the basis of that, they can then renegotiate the clause. But what it does is it sort of compels the parties to come to the table to have that discussion around, this is what I'm facing at the moment. This is the impact on me. Can we reconsider A and B and C? But you don't really try to, unlike the price, your typical price review or indexation mechanism, which you pre-agree what the framework will be, and then the thing just keeps recalibrating itself. For the hardship clause, you hardly do that. You just provide a platform and framework for them to have a discussion. Right?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think there's a question.
Okay, yes, Mr. Adewale, do you want to ask your question or should we read it out? Adewale Adebi, Olawale Adebi.
Yeah.
Will you unmute yourself?
Okay, well, I can see the question, so I can actually
yes,
just.
okay, maybe you can just read it. Yeah, no problem.
What can you say about the inflation?
So you can read it. You can read it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, great. So it's about hedging. So when we're talking about hedging, whose perspective are we looking at now? The transporter who gets a tariff, or the shipper who pays the tariff, irrespective of whatever party is in any transaction. Of course, you might, given the fact that there may be regulatory intervention, given the fact, as you mentioned, inflation and all sorts of things, even apart from inflation, just by the very fact of currency exchange risks might be a key concern. Even availability itself might be a concern, where you're not just fighting about the fact that the naira keeps getting devalued against the dollar. Access to the dollar itself actually becomes a problem. So typically parties to any of these long-term arrangements, particularly if they have financing behind them, the lenders will even require you to go and hedge. And what did you do? So you look at each of the components, either you're hedging against an exchange rate risk or some commodity risk, or etc. So you just take out a hedging contract for it. And what it does is to sort of somewhat insulate you from any of the adverse movements in either your pricing or any of the other conditionalities. So if it happens, you're not suffering excessively. Under your hedging contracts, you can then have some benefits, which of course, like I said again, if your lenders are on the back of your entire arrangement, the lenders will then benefit from that hedging arrangement. But yes, the hedging doesn't sit in the context of the GTA itself. It doesn't feature in the GTA itself. It's additional belts and braces, which somewhat collateral to it, but don't sit in the GTA itself. So you negotiate that separately, and then you get your hedging contract signed, and then you can then claim. But you typically don't, well, let me say I'm not seeing, not that it doesn't exist. I'm not aware that you would then have your hedging provisions in your gas transportation arrangements. It's possible that in some markets it's been created, but I'm not aware of it. So yes, hedging arrangements are allowed, but they're just collateral to it, or you sign separate arrangements to sort that out. It doesn't sit within the context of your GTA. So I hope that clarifies.
Okay, you have another question from Mr. David Amakiri. I don't know if you would like to read it, but you can just, since you can see it, maybe you would want to read it. He's saying, can you talk a bit about how invoicing could rate up to task or could have tax implications under the gas transportation agreement?
So I assume the question is how invoicing could relate to tax. Well, pretty much. Okay, your GTA pretty much will say, generally speaking, from a transaction point of view, that the shipper will be responsible for all taxes applicable to the gas molecules prior to the delivery point. That's the point at which the shipper hands over physical custody of the gas to the transporter. So if there's any applicable gases relating to the gas, well, you're responsible for it. Any applicable gases after the delivery points relating to the handling of the gas, operations, transporting it, the transporter will pay that. So, but in the context of an invoicing, so your invoicing will set out all the different components. If there's any tariffs payable, capacity charge, you pay something for tariff. If there's an overrun charge, you put it in the invoice component. Everything that's payable, you pay. Now, if there's taxes payable, so for the shipper who's paying money for a service that is receiving, because he's paying for a service that is receiving, which is the transportation services, he's supposed to pay, what do you call it, VAT. So, but of course, in the oil and gas sector, they have a mechanism via which they do sort of, it's not self-assessment, that's the word I'm looking for. But pretty much he will pay VAT is applicable to what is being supplied, given it's a service. So any other applicable taxes in the context, I can't think of any. You will simply include it in the invoices and then pass it on to the person that will pay. If the person that is going to pay is entitled to make any withholding, in this context, I'm not sure there's any withholding applicable in this case, then he will make the necessary withholdings, reflect it, and then make the necessary payments to you. So that's pretty much how it will work. Save for that, I'm not aware of any tax implications as it relates to invoicing. Save that any applicable taxes will be reflected in invoices payable by the shipper to the transporter. Yes.
Do we still have anybody that wants to ask Mr. Osuji a question or make an intervention before we end the presentation? Please kindly raise your hand or send your question to the chat box. Anybody? Mr. Osuji, it seems you've exhausted. Oh, I have one more question here before you go. I've almost forgotten. And it's a very important question. Sir, so I'm telling you. So you've been telling us about how the gas transportation agreements, how it's been structured. You gave us the background, the overview, you made us understand it as lawyers and all that. But the most important thing is now we have this understanding. How do we turn it into money for us, yes, because to me, I think that's the most important question. We've learned all these lessons. We know, we have an understanding of the principles that needs to be in this agreement, and you promised us a draft copy of what the agreement looks like to guide us. So when we are talking to clients, what rates should we have in mind when we want to charge for this kind of transactions? You see why I say it's a very important question.
That's a trap. Okay, let me put it this way. In terms of how do you utilize what's been learned, and I generally like to think that money follows value. Before you're able to charge money or a good rate for something, there must be some value you're offering. And the value you offer is a function of what you know, the knowledge and your ability to assist your client. So a client is a businessman. He is a oil and gas person, or maybe a financing person. And all he wants to do is to get his business done, get money in, finance it, and get out. Your job is for you to hold his hand, to first and foremost, guide him through all the minefields. But for you to be able to guide him through the minefields, you must understand where the mines are in the field. You must understand the industry in which he's supposed to play. That's one very key point that I try to tell to lawyers. You can't just be a lawyer in the room when you're negotiating gas agreements. You can't be a lawyer in the room. You have to be everything. You have to be an accountant. You have to be a tax person. You need to be a financing person. So you need to understand when, let's say you're negotiating for the shipper. You need to understand when the transporter tells you that he can't give you a carry forward right because operationally he can't make it available. You need to understand why. You may not agree from a negotiation point of view, but you need to understand why. So you don't get in the room and you say, no, I've signed another agreement what they give me now. No, not necessarily the case. So it's in that value, you're understanding the client's business and understanding the operational, commercial, and legal environment in which the clients operate, that you're then able to give that value. So when you're then able to do that, and to be honest, the only way to do it is to do it. Really, there's nobody that was born with a GTA in his hand. So if you're exposed to those transactions, you review or draft or engage or negotiate one. The more you do it, the better you get at it. The more you're familiar with it, the more you understand the principles around it. The more you negotiate, then the more you understand it from different perspectives. So maybe on one side, you're negotiating for a transporter today. Tomorrow, you're negotiating for a shipper or for somebody else entirely, or for even a lender who wants you to review a GTA to understand how the GTA will impact on his lending to a shipper or a transporter. So all those things are really that's really the value that you offer. Then when you are then able to offer that value by doing it, if you are not in a transaction, maybe you can look for books online, materials online, just to read up, ask questions, try to understand. There are a few things that will only come to you when you start negotiating it. Unfortunately, that's just the way it works. Not everything, you won't get everything from a book. So, but it doesn't matter. It's a process. Everything is a process. Even we on this side that are trying to sort of share ideas with the rest of the team on how these things work. We don't know it all. A new law, PIA has come in. PIA might have a few things that even affect GTAs. So we also need to relearn what we knew already. Network code is a new state of play. So we also need to relearn what we know, because we then need to be able to, sit down in the room and advise clients on how the network code will affect, not just saying, oh, there's a GTA, which is purely bilateral. So it's an ongoing process. But the more first is interest. If you have the interest, then you're willing to do a little bit more. Then the more you learn about these things, the more you get involved in them. Then you can in terms of pricing, it's difficult to say. Pricing is a very complicated process. Yes, sometimes you have a sense of what you want to be your hourly rates. Yes, you have a sense as to what you want to get as a lump sum. But more often than not, you also take into consideration the financial circumstances of the client. Sometimes the client is unable to really pay a premium at the point, and there's more value down the stream. So you just need to look at all sorts of things, and then you try to come up with what you think is a good balance. And as we say on this side, relationships are more important than naira and kobo. It looks academic when you say it, but it really is the fact. A good relationship with a client is more valuable than whatever you can charge a client in day one, because that good relationship is a pipeline for so many other things. So it's a bit of a balance. And then when you're not sure, you can ask somebody who knows, who is able to assist you or to advise. So that's just by a little, just by 2 pennies on that. I'm not sure if that has been helpful at all. Rakiba.
Yeah, Mr. Osuji, you see why I say that question is very important.
Yes, I see. Yes, I see.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We have come to the end of another presentation on how to manage. We have come to the end of another presentation on how to manage energy transactions in the African energy space. This training was done by the Lawyers in Energy Network in partnership with Centurion Law Group and Brumshi Consultancy. I would like to use this medium to thank Mr. Emeka Osuji. Mr. Emeka, we really appreciate you. This session was really interesting. It was really, yes, not that other sessions wasn't. You can see with the level of interactions and engagement from the audience, it shows that we really enjoyed your session, and we appreciate you taking out time. I know today is a very busy day for you in the office, but you spared out that time to give us this juicy brief. We really appreciate you a lot. Thank you so much. Even with the challenges you had to face yesterday, because he had already made the presentation for us. Unfortunately, he had a little accident with the system, and he had to start afresh just to create another presentation for us at the last minute. So, Mr. Osuji, we appreciate you a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rakiba. Thanks to everyone that listened, and I hope we took something out of it. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I would also like to thank our partners for making this training possible. And to you, our audience, thank you for still staying with us till now. We started this training last week, Monday, and we just finished day 6. Don't forget that we have 2 more days to go for this training, tomorrow and Thursday. Today is Tuesday. Tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. The training will be ending on Thursday. And from Thursday, we'll be sending out the links on how you can, the links you'll be filling for you to be able to get your certificate for having participated in this training. Then we would also be sending out a feedback form that you can send to us so that we will know where we can improve in future and if this training has been beneficial. Also, you can rewatch this edition, like we've always said, on our YouTube channel at Lawyers in Energy Network. You can also watch it live. If you don't want to join the Zoom meeting, you can just go on YouTube, Lawyers in Energy Network, click on it, and you'll see us there live. You can watch it live. You can also rewatch it at your leisure alongside other presentations and our past videos of our past events. Also know that all the presentations of the speakers can be accessed through your registered email. After every event, we send out emails to all our registered participants. We have over 410 people registered for this event. We send out the presentations to them on the Google Drive. There's a link where when you click it, you can access all the presentations that we have started, we had since Monday till now, and the other ones as we go. So you can access all those presentations from the Google Drive. Finally, people have also been asking us on how to be members of the Lawyers in Energy Network. And like I've always said, all you need to do to be members of the network is to go onto our website at www.lawyersinenergynetwork.com. And at the top of the page, you're going to see our subscription button. On that subscription button, just click it, fill the form, and make your payment. Then the secretariat will get back to you. Also know that this training is going to continue tomorrow by 10 o'clock, by 11 a.m. Central African time. And we also have another interesting person coming to put us through another agreement drafting. So please make it a date with us tomorrow. I remain Rakiba Oloko, the Executive Secretary of Lawyers in Energy Network. See you tomorrow.